I will say that when we look at some parallels, just as groundwork for the next chapter, because the next chapter gets into the actual crucifixion, we're going to focus just on what is actually in Matthew here. There are parallels, and it is interesting when you look at some individuals in the past have written a couple of books like the Harmony of the Gospels and whatnot, and there are ways for which I think you can put down a timetable. In fact, we've done it here in the past where you line up one chapter and one gospel account with the other chapter, and you kind of fill in some gaps because you have witness testimony being given here, and individuals are giving their own testimony. And just as any testimony would be, even in a group this small, that everyone would say something not contrary necessarily, but another person would add a detail that someone else wouldn't add to the conversation. But it is the putting together of the story that often requires a lot of what's the term that the detectives use? Bubble gum to the shoes or something like that. So yeah, you got to get all the facts then, like Joe Friday, and then put them together when you're doing the whole story. But we're focusing just on Matthew's account, and I find it interesting. There are a couple of things that Matthew will bring out that the other witnesses and or testimonies don't mention. So it is interesting. But there is something for us to also consider, and two things actually, and that is the timing of this when it actually occurred compared to the timings that we have now. Um, Based on what we understand, it seems likely that this would have occurred with a win on Wednesday, I should say, which would have been Nisan 14 that particular year. There would have been a preparation day for an annual Sabbath, not the weekly Sabbath. And as a result of that, Jesus would have been brought before Pilate, who was the Roman governor of Palestine at the time. Jesus would have been crucified and then ultimately died physically around roughly 3 p.m., we would call 3 p.m. And then his body would have been put into a tomb right at twilight or as the day was ending. And of course, there would be significance given to this because there is the significance of him stating that the only sign that he would give of his messiahship was the 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the earth, and then referencing that back to Jonah and his time in the great fish's belly. Of course, that would bring us to the next day being on a Thursday, of what we call Thursday, or Nisan 15, which would have been a high holy day, which would have been the first day of the days of unleavened bread. And of course, we know there's going to be the tombs. This would have resulted in such a fashion that Jesus Christ would have been resurrected as that year the Sabbath would have been ended, resulting in the women going to the tomb early in the morning of what we would call today Sunday, witnessing him. He had not yet risen to go to the Father, as we know from other gospel testimony, but we know that he would have been visible to them and he would have been resurrected, which correlates with the wave sheaf and how that whole process went into effect when they would cut the wave sheaf as the Sabbath was ending, as you begin to count the 50 days or the 7 complete Sabbaths to get to Pentecost. So you have the barley and then leading to the wheat. And so you have the first fruit, the barley, Jesus Christ, and the first fruits being Pentecost with the wheat. And so there's significance to this. And the timing, while not necessarily the way it is this year, would have been a fulfillment of prophecy and would have been of significance based on the time that it occurred when Jesus actually died and when these events occurred. Now, the timing of the crucifixion is another thing when you're looking at gospel accounts. It is interesting, just as you would think. There could be a lot of ways of, as they say, different ways to peel back the onion or skin a cat, as the old saying goes today. That kind of sounds really bad. Kind of hate that analogy that I just gave there. Different ways of viewing things, and probably a better way of saying that. But the way that the Jews numbered the hours of the day and the way the Romans would enumerate the hours of the day were different, and they resulted in coming to different times. So when you look at the gospel accounts, you'll see that Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they're going to utilize the way the Jews utilized it. While if you read the gospel account of John and the crucifixion, you will recognize that he's using the Roman method of keeping up with the hours of the day. It's not a contradiction, it's just stating the same thing in a different methodology. And it was the different methodologies that were used. And in fact, just to expound upon that, you'll notice as we begin and read in this next chapter, there will be Jesus actually speaking some of his last words. It is a combination of Aramaic and Hebrew that he's speaking, which always kind of lends this comment to me null and void that certain individuals say, oh, well, you have to use the sacred names. You can't just speak anyway and act like Hebrew is this great language. Well, Jesus spoke when he was here on earth in Aramaic. He didn't speak always in Hebrew. And even his last words were a combination of both languages. So it is interesting. And one other point that we'll draw to as we read this next chapter is the darkness that spreads over the land. And I'll just bring this point up. Recently we had a solar eclipse, and they're always fascinating. There is no doubt about it. A solar eclipse is a fascinating event. Most solar eclipses do not last for 3 hours. The solar eclipses are predicted, they can be calculated, and they can tell you in a number of years in advance when they're going to happen. Mark Twain would write about it in the Connecticut Yankee. It actually, he used it as a way of saving his life of the character by knowing when the eclipse was going to occur. But most eclipses only last at maximum 7 minutes, maximum. And yet this one lasted 3 hours. God was obviously making a point here. There was a point to be made here, which, I know some of the churches of God, some individuals have made some statements. Well, this last one was a very important solar eclipse because it went over Jonah, Texas, in the totality region. And then it also went through 7, I think, different towns in the United States with the name of Nineveh. My point in all of that was to say, well, that's an interesting fact, but it didn't last in anything that was beyond what was already calculated. So if God's going to be using something as a sign, it's going to stand out and be a little bit different than what man can calculate and can answer for. But it is interesting. Just some sidelights there. But definitely this solar eclipse far exceeds anything that we've probably ever seen on Earth since, or ever will be potentially. So I have all those comments just as some background information as we begin to now look at chapter 27. And I don't know how this hits you, but every time I read all of these gospel accounts of the crucifixion, there is an emotional aspect of this that really tugs at your heart. You hate to see evil win, and win in a way that, while it's not winning ultimately for God's purpose, you just hate to see this happen, but it had to happen. And I guess the bigger part of it is you're responsible for this. I'm responsible for this because of our sins, which is sometimes something that Christians don't view as a necessary component. But let's begin in chapter 27. And again, I'm reading from the New American Standard. Verse 1. Now, when morning came, all of the chief priests and the elders and the people conferred together against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate the governor. Then, when Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, I have sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they said, what is that to us? See to that yourself. And he threw the pieces of silver into the temple sanctuary and departed. And he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests took the pieces of silver and said, "It is not lawful to put them into the temple treasury, since it was the price of blood." Then they conferred together, and with the money bought the potter's field as a burial place for strangers. For this reason, that field has been called the field of blood to this day. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, and they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of the one whose price had been set by the sons of Israel, and they gave them for the potter's field as the Lord directed me. Again, fulfillment of prophecy, going back to the prophet of Jeremiah. Verse 11, then Jesus stood before the governor, and the governor questioned him, saying, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus said to him, "It is as you say." And while he was being accused by the chief priests and elders, he did not answer. Then Pilate said to him, "Do you and hear how many things they testify against you?" And he did not answer with him regarding even a single charge. So the governor was quite amazed. Now at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the people any one prisoner whom they wanted. And at that time, they were holding a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. So when the people gathered together, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who's called Christ?" For he knew that because of envy, they had handed him over. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent him a message saying, "Have nothing to do with that righteous man. For last night I suffered greatly in a dream because of him." But the chief priests and the elders persuaded the crowds to ask for Barabbas and to put Jesus to death. But the governor said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Then what shall I do with Jesus, who is called Christ?" And they all said, "Crucify him." And he said, "Why? What evil has he done?" But they kept shouting all the more, saying, "Crucify him." When Pilate saw that he was accomplishing nothing, but rather that a riot was starting, he took water, washed his hands in front of the crowd, saying, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to what yourself." And all the people said, "His blood shall be on us and our children." And then he released Barabbas for them, but after having Jesus scourged, he handed him over for the crucifixion. Then the soldiers, the governors, took Jesus into the praetorium and gathered the whole Roman cohort around him. They stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and after twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head, a reed in his right hand, and they knelt down before him, mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews." They spat on him. They took the reed and they began to beat him on the head. And after they had mocked him, they took the scarlet robe off of him and put his own garments back on him, and they led him away to crucify him. And as they were coming out, they found a man of Cyrene named Simon, who they pressed into service to bear his cross. And when they had come to the place called Golgotha, which means place of the skull, they gave him wine to drink mixed with gall. After tasting it, he was unwilling to drink. And this was some kind of a narcotic that they would give to make it where, I guess, some mercy given to them at that time. Verse 35. And when they had crucified him, they divided up his garments among themselves by casting lots. And sitting down, they began to keep watch over him there. And above his head, they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." At that time, two robbers who were crucified with him, one on the right and one on the left. And those passing, were also hurling abuses at him, wagging their heads, saying, "You who are going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." In the same way, the high priest also, along with the scribes and elders, were mocking him and saying, "He saved others. He cannot save himself. He is the King of Israel. Let him now come down from the cross, and we will believe in him. He trusts in God. Let God rescue him now, if he delights in him. For he said, I am the Son of God." The robbers who were crucified with him were also insulting him with the same words, talking about having it come from all directions when you're down at your lowest point. Verse 45, "And now from the 6th hour darkness fell upon the land until the 9th hour. About the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani. That is, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of those who were standing by, when they heard it, began saying, This man is calling for Elijah. Immediately one of them ran and took a sponge. He filled it with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave him to drink. But the rest of them said, Let us see whether Elijah will come to save him. And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the veil in the temple was torn in two from the top to the bottom. And the earth shook, and the rocks were split. The tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. Coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they entered the holy city and appeared to many. Now the centurion who was there with him, keeping guard over Jesus, when they saw the earthquake and the things that were happening, became very frightened and said, Truly, this was the Son of God. Many women who were looking on from a distance, who had followed Jesus from Galilee while ministering to him, among them were Mary Magdalene and Mary, the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. When it was evening, there came a rich man from Arimathea named Joseph, who himself had become a disciple of Jesus. This man went to Pilate and asked for the body of Jesus. And when Pilate ordered it to be given to him, and Joseph took the body, wrapped it in clean linen cloth, and laid it in his own new tomb, which he had hewn out of the rock, and he rolled a large stone against the entrance of the tomb and went away. Mary Magdalene was there, and the other Mary, which Scripture tells us that's possible Mary, the wife of Cleopas, was sitting opposite in the grave. And on the next day, the day after the preparation, the chief priests and the Pharisees gathered together with Pilate and said, Sir, we remember that when he was still alive, that deceiver, notice that, they give him Satan's name, said, After 3 days, I am going to rise again. Therefore, give orders for the grave to be made secure until the 3rd day. Otherwise, his disciples may come and steal him away and say to the people that he's risen from the dead. And the last deception will be far worse than the first. And Pilate said, You have a guard. Go, make it as secure as you know how. And they went, and they made the grave secure along with the guard and set up a seal on the stone. So it appears they also sealed off the stone in addition to that. So we see as we conclude that chapter that the whole outline of the story from Matthew's account of what happened, we see that it results in Jesus not giving an answer when certain accusations are made, accepting all of these insults. And I guess the first question that I have here is, what lesson or lessons can we learn from Jesus's character under duress when he's in Pilate's presence? Think of what Jesus went through and how he responded. I think when you look at this, it truly shows that there's a time to speak and a time to be silent. And I would that God would give us the ability to discern when was the appropriate time to be silent, and to be silent as opposed to speaking sometimes. And this was under duress, which I think speaks obviously highly of the character of our Savior. Khaki?
What was going on around Jesus too, it makes you think that, and it's so relevant in our society today. Evil, when it's confronted, shouts and drowns out all sense of reason.
Mhm.
These were the same people who had been with Jesus in the synagogue and listened to him. We don't know, some of them may have been people he healed.
Could have been.
But when you have, like Bill mentioned, you get this frenzy, a crowd,
Mob mentality.
and they're shouting, and that evil just shouts louder than reason.
Hmm. No, I mean, we can obviously, I think, draw some very strong parallels to what we see. And it's not even necessarily everything we see today, although that's front and center to us. But I mean, you can go back to 1968. You can go back to, the civil rights era in the 60s. I mean, you can go back. I mean, that mob mentality is all French Revolution. It's always been here as long as Satan is here. We're seeing a rendition of it today with mob mentality going on. And that was truly what happened here. I mean, and I guess the thing when you think about it, what is, I guess, most striking about mob mentality is that it totally ignores rationality. And that is a scary thing because, when people are just give over to emotions and they don't have the ability to keep emotions in control. Emotions are good. God created them to move us and to get us to do certain things, but they don't come without having the Holy Spirit to guide and control us. And sometimes I think when we look at Jesus Christ under this duress, he's in control, self control, and he's even controlling his tongue. And I think that's a powerful lesson for you and for me in the world we live in.
And he knew what the Father had given him to do, and he knew he had all authority. So he knew what his mission was, and he didn't bow to what was going on around him. He stayed very true to his course.
Recently there was a recasting, or broadcasting, I should say, of Star Wars. And I don't know if you like Star Wars or don't like Star Wars, but there's a Return of the Jedi where Luke Skywalker is captive by Darth Vader and what is oftentimes looked at as being Satan, the evil spirit there. And the evil spirit was tempting Luke Skywalker to actually reach out and to create violence because he knew that if he could get him to do something, he was in control of him. And I look at this not to glorify Hollywood, but in a similar way. Christ was not going to allow everything that his purpose was and come up to this point to be nullified by a human reaction that would be a knee jerk, that would be, from a human standpoint, reasonable, but it would thwart the whole effort of what was being done. And I think that's powerful. And that's the character you must have, I must have, and may be required to have in the future under a lot of duress. Possible, just possible. Something to think about. I know that there's some scriptures here that I wanted to build this in because we read over a lot of things that happened. And John is very careful and meticulous in his gospel account to point to certain scriptures as fulfillment of prophecy that Jesus was conducting, and that was to show him and prove that he was the Son of God. Matthew, not quite so much. But in what we just read, there are prophecies that were fulfilled by Jesus actually being on that cross. And I have here 10 different prophecies and the scriptures associated with them. First was the Messiah would be hated without a cause. That's in Psalm 69:4. And also it's referenced in John 15, verses 24 through 25. The Messiah would be crucified with criminals. That's from Isaiah 53. And we see the New Testament references to those in Matthew and in Mark. The Messiah would be given vinegar to drink, or gall. That comes from Psalm 69. And then you see the references that are made in the gospel accounts here in Matthew 27 and in John 19. And it is interesting that that mixture was to be something that would be like a narcotic, in that they would view it at that society and that time as a way to make it not so painful. But Christ rejected that because he was taking on all the sins of the world, having a clear mind, clear conscience of knowing exactly what he was doing. It's interesting too that the Messiah's hands and feet would be pierced. We know that with the crucifixion and the stakes, the nails, and that comes from Psalms 22, verse 16, and from Zechariah 12:10, also referenced in John 20. Jesus would be mocked and ridiculed. How many times did we just read in that testimony what occurred to him and what he went through? And to know who he was and the purpose for what he was doing, you talk about doing a deed and being not received and not being thankful for what he was doing, and yet continuing on. And of course, that comes from the Old Testament in Psalms 22. You see as well in what we just read, the soldiers would be gambling for the garments of the Messiah. That comes from Psalms 22. References are made here in Matthew 27 and in Luke 23. And then the Messiah's bones would not be broken. That goes all the way back to the Passover lamb of Exodus 12, that they weren't to break any of the bones in that. In addition, that comes from Psalms 34. And it is interesting that it's also referenced in John chapter 19. We see that the Messiah would be forsaken by God. God the Father would turn his back because Jesus would be taking on all the sin, and he would be, I guess, ultimately what we would say is the epitome of what sin was, and God the Father would turn away from that. Hence the adding of the Aramaic and the Hebrew, my God, why have you forsaken me? And that comes from Psalms chapters 22 and 35. The Messiah would pray for his enemies. Of course, that would come as well. When he would say, Father, forgive them, they don't know what they do. That would be in Psalms 109. And then, of course, the soldier actually piercing the side, which many people look up that when he gave up his spirit. In some translations, here, I guess it's right around verse 47, 46, 47. Some translations will add in, but that is where you actually see where the soldier takes a spear and pierces the side, and that would be the ultimate death. It could have been when he just passed out due to the flogging, the scourging that he took with the cat of nine tails, that would have been inclusive of, glass and bones and metal, and the beating that he took before the crucifixion. And of course, we realize that we are healed through those stripes that he took. We get that from Isaiah. And we know too that he would die from the piercing of the actual sword, or spear, I should say, and that comes from Zechariah chapter 12. So, you look at all this, that these were details, things that he was going through, things that are in the story that are testimony that he was who he said he was. And he was fulfilling scripture, but his fulfillment and his testimony of who he said he was the 3 days and 3 nights. Yet all this is more evidence given to prove that he was who he said he was. I ask this question: what lesson or lessons can we learn from the fact that this solar eclipse occurred that lasted for 3 hours, from the 6th hour to the 9th hour? Based on the way the Jews would look at it, it'd be from 12 until 3. What do you think, Khaki?
You made the comment about the eclipse was, this was similar, this was the only statement that God made, it's the darkness.
Yeah.
He made no verbal statements, that was his statement.
What do you think that statement meant? Any thoughts? This is outside the norm. Like I said, most eclipses last no more than 7 minutes, roughly. I mean, not 3 hours. This is like, this ain't no coincidence. This is evidence something is in power here for 3 hours.
John talks about people doing evil in the darkness.
Mhm.
Christ, the contrast being light. For that period of time, the darkness appeared to win, appeared to be taking over.
I agree. I mean, I think that is definitely a lesson that we're taking out of that is that this had ultimately resulted in this great act. You have the individual dying for them, and you see the mob mentality, all the things we've discussed, and God is making the statement of this is what leads you, and this is what darkness is as a result of this mentality. Bill?
There could be a correlation between the 3 hours of darkness and the 3 days that Christ was in the tomb, signifying his complete death.
Could be. Could be. I think that that's possible. I think that's could play into that as being a proof text, but definitely he was the light of the world, as John tells us, and he's gone now. And now you have darkness left as a result of that. And I think that is a powerful statement. Mr. Bogan?
Timing on that, 3 hours or 3 days, could be significant too, to let everyone know that was the truth.
Mhm.
Because 2 or 3
Mhm.
makes a witness of the truth.
Right. That comes all the way in Deuteronomy as far as how truth was to be established in the mouths of 2 or 3 witnesses. That's true. Okay. What are some lessons or lessons that we can learn about the crucifixion that teach us about ourselves, about Jesus, and about the Father? Purposely asking some different type questions to get us to think a little more outside of just a storyline.
I think it relates to going back to the valedictory oath in Genesis 15. And we know without the shedding of blood, there can be no forgiveness of sins. So all of that plays into the crucifixion of Christ.
Okay. My mind goes to the Apostle Paul saying that I am crucified with Christ. And I think that's the lesson we learn about ourselves. We see that this went through, or what Christ went through, the difficulty, the torment. And if we're truly crucified with Christ, as Paul says, meaning crucifying the self will, it's going to be a bloody and torturous process. You're going to have forces of evil, Satan and his influence on society, and that society having influence on you. We talk about the 3 S's: Satan, society, and the self as being our primary enemies. And the crucifixion of Christ overcame all those things. He could have called down legions from heaven at a moment's notice to stop all that, but he didn't because he was doing the Father's will, not his will. The taking away of the cup, we read earlier, it was the Father's will he was more worried about. Satan being behind all of this, entering into Judas as a mechanism to put in place a mob mentality, the society. You see all those things in here. And yet he overcame all those things. And we can overcome it if we will sacrifice and crucify ourselves too. I see that as a message here, using what the Apostle Paul says. And to the level that we commit to it, it'll be a difficult task. How are we all in or not? I guess is one question. Jesus was all in, but are we? An ultimate question for us. The Father was all in. Are we? Khaki?
The lesson in terms of the crucifixion for Jesus, when you go through what physically occurs, it's very difficult for a person to keep himself up and probably even whisper. He said Jesus loudly cried out. So that had to take a great deal of effort. But to me, that ending was a declaration of victory. victorious, and it was a shout of completion. So, looking at it from that aspect, the crucifixion tells us that Jesus and the Father fulfilled their promises, through their plan that Jesus executed on behalf of the Father, because it was a victory. It
Yep.
was a victory run.
Yep. And ultimately, I mean, what appears to be on the surface sometimes is not what reality is in the world we live in. And, no doubt the Pharisees probably thought, well, this is great. We got it all wrapped up. Then we have chapter 28.